The morning
Please,
sun
you have to
cast long
understand.
shadows
I do,
across
and
the
I'm here for you.
manicured gardens of Thornfield Palace as Princess Isabella made her way through the ancient corridors. Her footsteps echoed softly against the marble floors, a sound that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat over the past 43 years of her life. Today felt different, though, charged with an electricity she couldn't quite place. Isabella had always been known as the steadfast one, the reliable princess who never caused scandals or made headlines for the wrong reasons. Unlike her younger brother Prince Alexander, who seemed to find himself in the tabloids weekly, or her sister-in-law Catherine, whose every move was dissected by the media, Isabella had managed to maintain a relatively quiet existence within the royal family. She preferred it that way, finding solace in her charitable work and her passion for equestrian sports. The palace was unusually quiet this morning. Most of the staff were preparing for the upcoming state dinner, an elaborate affair that would host dignitaries from across Europe. Isabella's mother, Queen Victoria Elizabeth, had been planning this event for months, and the pressure was mounting on everyone to ensure everything went perfectly. The Queen, now 78, still commanded respect and attention wherever she went, her presence filling any room she entered. As Isabella rounded the corner toward the East Wing, she nearly collided with her younger brother Alexander. At 39, he still maintained the boyish charm that had made him a favorite with the public, though the years of royal duty had added lines around his eyes that spoke of responsibilities he had never asked for. "Bella," he said, using the childhood nickname that only family was allowed to use. "Have you seen Catherine this morning? She wasn't at breakfast, and we're supposed to review the seating arrangements for tonight." Isabella shook her head, her dark hair catching the light streaming through the tall windows. "I haven't seen her since yesterday evening. She seemed upset about something then, too. Did you two have an argument?" Alexander's expression darkened slightly. "Not exactly an argument, but there's been tension lately. You know how she gets when there's pressure from the press. The recent speculation about our marriage has been particularly brutal." The speculation Alexander referred to had been building for months. Rumors of discord between him and Catherine had been circulating in the tabloids, fueled by carefully analyzed photographs and unnamed sources. The couple had been married for 15 years, and their relationship had always seemed solid to those who knew them personally. But the public scrutiny that came with royal life had a way of magnifying every small disagreement into a potential crisis. Isabella placed a comforting hand on her brother's arm. "You know how these things go. The press needs stories, and when there aren't any real scandals, they create their own. Your marriage is stronger than whatever they're writing about." "I hope you're right," Alexander replied, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty that Isabella found troubling. "Catherine has been distant lately. She spends hours in her private study, and when I try to talk to her, she says she's fine, but I can tell she's not." Before Isabella could respond, the sound of quick footsteps echoed from the corridor behind them. They turned to see Lady Margaret Thornbury, the Queen's private secretary, approaching with an expression of barely controlled urgency. "Your Royal Highnesses," she said, offering a quick curtsy. "Her Majesty requests your immediate presence in the blue drawing room. Princess Catherine is already there." Isabella and Alexander exchanged glances. The blue drawing room was typically reserved for serious family discussions or meetings with high-ranking officials. Whatever was happening, it was important enough to interrupt their morning schedules. They followed Lady Margaret through the palace, passing portraits of long-dead monarchs whose eyes seemed to watch their every move. Isabella had grown up with these paintings, but today they felt particularly imposing, as if the weight of centuries of royal tradition was pressing down upon her shoulders. The blue drawing room lived up to its name, with deep sapphire walls adorned with priceless artwork and furniture that had been in the royal collection for generations. Queen Victoria Elizabeth sat in her usual chair, her posture as regal as ever despite her advanced age. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a navy blue suit that emphasized her still sharp blue eyes. Catherine stood by the window, her silhouette outlined against the morning light. Even in profile, Isabella could see the tension in her sister-in-law's shoulders. Catherine had always been beautiful, with the kind of grace that made her perfect for royal life. But today she seemed fragile somehow, like a delicate piece of china that might crack under the slightest pressure. "Children," the Queen said, her voice carrying the authority that had guided the nation for over 5 decades. "Please sit down. We have a matter of some urgency to discuss." Isabella chose a seat near her mother, while Alexander moved to stand behind Catherine. He placed his hands on her shoulders in a gesture that seemed both protective and possessive. Catherine didn't lean into his touch as she normally would have. "Mother," Alexander said, "if this is about the state dinner tonight, I assure you everything is under control." Queen Victoria Elizabeth raised a hand to silence him. "This is not about the dinner, though that is certainly important. This concerns some information that has come to our attention regarding potential complications within our family." The word complications hung in the air like a storm cloud. In royal parlance, complications usually meant scandal, and scandal was something the family had worked hard to avoid in recent years. "What kind of complications?" Isabella asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The Queen's gaze moved to Catherine, who finally turned from the window. Her face was pale, and Isabella could see the remnants of tears in her eyes. Whatever this was about, Catherine was at the center of it. "Catherine," the Queen said gently, "perhaps you would like to explain to your family what you shared with me this morning." Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirt. She had always been articulate, confident in public speaking, but now she seemed to struggle for words. I received a phone call yesterday," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "from someone claiming to have information about my past. Information that could be damaging to the family if it became public." Alexander's face darkened. "What kind of information?" Catherine looked at him, and Isabella could see the pain in her eyes. "Before I married you, before I knew I would become part of this family, I made some choices that I'm not proud of. Nothing illegal, nothing truly shameful, but things that could be misconstrued or sensationalized if they were to surface now." The silence in the room was deafening. Isabella felt her heart racing as she tried to imagine what Catherine might be referring to. Her sister-in-law had always seemed like the perfect royal wife, poised, charitable, devoted to her duties. "Catherine," the Queen said softly, "we've discussed this, and you know that whatever happened in your past before you joined this family is not necessarily relevant to your position now. What concerns me is that someone is attempting to use this information as leverage." "Leverage for what?" Isabella asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Money," Catherine said simply. "They want money to keep quiet. But it's not just about the payment. They made it clear that this is just the beginning. They have other information about other members of the family, and they plan to release it gradually unless their demands are met." Alexander moved to the chair beside Catherine and took her hand. "Why didn't you tell me about this immediately?" "Because I was scared," Catherine admitted. "I was scared of how you would react, scared of what it would mean for our children, scared of disappointing the Queen and the family that has given me so much." Isabella felt a surge of sympathy for her sister-in-law. Royal life meant living under constant scrutiny, where every mistake, no matter how small or how long ago, could become front-page news. The pressure to be perfect was immense, and the consequences of falling short could be devastating. "What exactly are they threatening to reveal?" Alexander asked, his voice carefully controlled. Catherine hesitated, glancing at the Queen, who nodded encouragingly. "When I was in university, I was involved with a group of activists. Environmental protesters, mostly. We organized demonstrations, occupied buildings, engaged in what could be called civil disobedience. Nothing violent, but there were arrests, court appearances, and some rather unflattering photographs." Isabella could see why Catherine was worried. While environmental activism was generally viewed positively by the public, the royal family was expected to remain politically neutral. Images of Catherine being arrested or engaging in radical protests could be problematic, especially given the current political climate. "Additionally," Catherine continued, "there was a relationship I had during that time. Someone who was controversial. A professor who was later dismissed from the university for his extreme political views. Our relationship was brief and ended before I met Alexander, but the photographs from that period could be taken out of context. The Queen leaned forward in her chair. Catherine, my dear, while these revelations are certainly unfortunate, they're not insurmountable. The real concern is the pattern of blackmail that seems to be emerging. If we capitulate to these demands, it will only encourage more of the same. But what's the alternative? Catherine asked, her voice breaking slightly. If these images surface, if my past becomes public in the way they're threatening, it won't just affect me. It will reflect on Alexander, on the children, on the entire family. Alexander squeezed her hand. We face this together, whatever it takes. You're not alone in this. Isabella watched the exchange between her brother and sister-in-law, feeling a complex mix of emotions. She admired Catherine's honesty and vulnerability, but she was also concerned about the implications for the family. The royal family's popularity with the public was crucial to their continued relevance, and scandals, even minor ones, could have far-reaching consequences. Have you considered that this might not actually be about Catherine's past at all? Isabella said suddenly, the thought occurring to her as she spoke. What if someone is using these relatively minor incidents as a way to test our response? To see how we handle pressure? The Queen's eyebrows rose slightly, a sign that Isabella had captured her attention. Explain what you mean, dear. Well, Catherine's past, while potentially embarrassing, isn't really scandalous by modern standards. Environmental activism and a relationship with a controversial professor, these are things that many people could relate to, especially younger generations. But if someone wanted to see how the family responds to threats, this would be an ideal starting point. Alexander considered this. You're suggesting this is reconnaissance? A way to gauge our vulnerabilities before launching something bigger? Exactly, Isabella replied. Think about it. If their real goal was money, they're easier targets than the royal family. We have security, lawyers, resources to fight back. But if their goal is destabilization, then testing our response patterns makes sense. Catherine looked between the siblings, hope beginning to replace some of the fear in her expression. So you think this might not be about me, specifically? I think you're being used, Isabella said gently, which doesn't make it less serious, but it might change how we approach the situation. The Queen had been listening to this exchange with the kind of focused attention she reserved for matters of state. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of experience managing crises. Isabella raises an excellent point, she said. In my experience, those who seek to harm the monarchy rarely start with their strongest ammunition. They test the waters, gauge our responses, look for weaknesses in our defenses. So what do? Alexander asked. We prepare, the Queen replied. We gather information about who is making these threats. We assess what other vulnerabilities might exist within the family. And we decide how much we're willing to reveal voluntarily versus what we absolutely must keep private. Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. The idea that someone was systematically probing the family's vulnerabilities was far more frightening than a simple blackmail attempt. It suggested a level of organization and planning that could pose a serious threat to the monarchy itself. Mother, she said, do we have any idea who might be behind this? Any sense of their motivations beyond money? That's what we need to find out, the Queen replied. I've already contacted our security team, and they're beginning an investigation. But we need to be prepared for the possibility that this is just the beginning. Catherine stood up suddenly, moving back to the window. I feel so stupid, she said, her voice filled with self-recrimination. I should have anticipated that my past would eventually become an issue. I should have been more careful. Catherine, Alexander said firmly, you were 20 years old. You were passionate about causes you believed in. There's nothing shameful about that. But there's nothing naive about it either, Isabella added. You lived your life before you became part of this family. And that life included making choices based on your values and beliefs. The fact that those choices are now being used against you doesn't invalidate them. The Queen rose from her chair, a signal that the formal part of their discussion was ending. We will weather this storm, as we have weathered others. But I want all of you to be aware that the coming weeks may be challenging. We must present a united front support each other, and remember that our strength lies in our unity. As they prepared to leave the blue drawing room, Isabella caught sight of herself in one of the ornate mirrors that adorned the walls. She looked composed, even regal, but inside she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Whatever was coming, she knew she would need to be strong not just for herself, but for her entire family. The morning that had started so peacefully now seemed like a distant memory. As they walked back through the corridors of Thornfield Palace, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The single whisper that Catherine had shared with the Queen that morning had set events in motion that would test every bond within their family. Outside, the preparations for the state dinner continued, staff members bustling about their duties with the same dedication they showed every day. But inside the palace, a different kind of preparation was beginning, the kind that would determine whether the royal family could survive whatever storm was heading their way. Isabella paused at the window of her private sitting room, looking out at the gardens where she had walked so peacefully just hours before. The sun was higher now, casting different shadows, and she realized that nothing would ever look quite the same again. The whisper had been heard, and now they all had to live with the consequences of whatever truths it had revealed. Hashtag a single whisper. Part 2, a fictional royal drama * 3 days had passed since the revelation in the blue drawing room, and the atmosphere at Thornfield Palace had grown increasingly tense. The state dinner had proceeded without incident, but Isabella could tell that the smiles were more forced, the conversations more careful, and the family members more watchful of each other than usual. Isabella found herself walking the same corridor where she had encountered Alexander that fateful morning, but this time she was seeking solitude rather than company. The investigation into Catherine's blackmailers had begun in earnest, and the security team's initial findings have been both enlightening and disturbing. Lord Christopher Hartwell, the head of royal security, had briefed the family the previous evening. A tall, distinguished man in his 50s who had served the crown for over 2 decades, he rarely showed emotion, but Isabella had detected genuine concern in his voice as he presented his findings. The phone call to Catherine had been traced to a burner phone purchased with cash in London. The caller had used voice-altering technology, making identification nearly impossible. But more troubling was the sophistication of the operation. Whoever was behind this had detailed knowledge not only of Catherine's past, but also of the family's daily routines, security protocols, and even private conversations. Isabella paused at the portrait of her great-grandmother, Queen Adelaide, who had reigned during a particularly turbulent period in the nation's history. The painted eyes seemed to offer a silent reminder that royal families had faced challenges before and survived. But this felt different somehow, more personal, more invasive. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket. A text message from her assistant reminded her of the afternoon's scheduled events. A visit to the children's hospital where she served as patron, followed by a meeting with the board of her environmental charity. Normal life had to continue, even as the family dealt with this crisis behind closed doors. As she made her way to her private apartments to change for the hospital visit, Isabella noticed Catherine emerging from the Queen's private study. Her sister-in-law looked exhausted, her usual polished appearance showing signs of strain. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't been sleeping well, and her normally perfect posture seemed slightly defeated. "Catherine," Isabella called softly, not wanting to startle her. Catherine turned, managing a wan smile. "Isabella, I was just updating Her Majesty on some additional information that Lord Hartwell requested." "Additional information?" Catherine glanced around, ensuring they were alone in the corridor. "They asked me to compile a complete list of everyone I knew during my university years. Friends, professors, fellow activists, romantic relationships. It's extensive." Isabella could only imagine how difficult that must have been. "I'm sure that was painful to revisit. What's worse is realizing how many people might have access to compromising information about me. And that's just my past. What about other family members? What about you or Alexander, or even the Queen herself?" The implication hung between them like a dark cloud. If Catherine's relatively tame past could be weaponized, what about more serious secrets that might exist within the family? Isabella had always prided herself on living a clean life, but everyone had moments they weren't proud of, decisions that could be taken out of context. Catherine, you can't blame yourself for having lived a normal life before joining this family, Isabella said firmly. If anything, your authenticity is part of what makes the public love you. You're not some manufactured royal figure. You're real, with real experiences and real growth. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. But what if the public doesn't see it that way? What if they see someone who is deceiving them all along? Before Isabella could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps echoed from the main corridor. Alexander appeared, his face flushed as if he had been running. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his tie askew and his hair uncombed. "Catherine, there you are," he said breathlessly. "We need to talk. Now." Isabella sensed that this was a private moment between husband and wife, but Alexander's next words stopped her from leaving. "Isabella, you should hear this too. It affects all of us." Catherine's face paled. "What's happened?" Alexander pulled out his phone, showing them both a news alert that had just appeared. The headline read, "Royal Security Breach. Palace sources confirm ongoing investigation." Isabella's heart sank as she read the brief article. While it didn't mention Catherine specifically, it revealed that the royal family was dealing with a security issue involving potential blackmail. The article cited unnamed palace sources and suggested that more details would be emerging in the coming days. "How did they find out about the investigation?" Catherine whispered. "That's what Lord Hartwell is trying to determine," Alexander replied grimly. "But the fact that information is leaking from within the palace suggests our problems are even worse than we thought." Isabella felt a chill run through her. The idea that someone within their inner circle might be feeding information to outside sources was almost more disturbing than the original blackmail attempt. The palace staff were like family. Many had served for decades, their loyalty beyond question. "We need to get back to Mother immediately," Isabella said. "She needs to know about this development." They made their way quickly to the Queen's private apartments, their footsteps echoing urgently through the corridors. Isabella couldn't help but notice how different the palace felt now. Instead of a sanctuary, it seemed full of potential threats and hidden dangers. Queen Victoria Elizabeth was in her private sitting room, reviewing papers with her private secretary. When she saw her children's faces, she immediately dismissed Lady Margaret and gestured for them to sit. "I assume you've seen the news alert," she said without preamble. "Mother, how did they find out?" Alexander asked. The Queen's expression was grave. "Lord Hartwell has been conducting discreet inquiries among the staff. So far, he's identified 3 people who would have had access to the information that appeared in the news report. All 3 have been with the family for over 10 years. Catherine sank into a chair as if the weight of this revelation was too much to bear. "So someone I see every day, someone I trust, has been reporting on my private crisis to the press." "We don't know that for certain yet," the Queen replied carefully. "But we must consider all possibilities." Isabella's mind was racing. "Mother, what if this leak wasn't about betraying Catherine specifically? What if someone is being forced to provide information?" The Queen's eyebrows rose slightly. "Explain." "Well, if whoever is behind this blackmail scheme has information about staff members as well as family members, they might be using that leverage to create sources inside the palace. It would be the perfect way to stay ahead of our responses and countermeasures." Alexander nodded slowly. "That would make more sense than believing that people who have served us faithfully for years suddenly decided to betray us. It would also mean that our problems are much more extensive than we originally thought," the Queen observed. "If multiple people are being coerced, then whoever is behind this has been planning for a very long time." Catherine looked up from her hands, her voice barely audible. "This is all my fault. If I had never made that phone call, if I had just ignored the threats." "Catherine, stop," Isabella said firmly. "You did exactly what you should have done. You brought the threat to the family immediately, and you've been honest about everything. None of this is your fault. The queen stood and moved to the window, her silhouette outlined against the afternoon light much as Catherine's had been 3 days earlier. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of decades of dealing with crises. In times like these, it's easy to assign blame or look for someone at fault. But the truth is, we are dealing with a sophisticated operation that was designed to cause exactly this kind of confusion and self-doubt. Our strength lies in remaining united and thinking clearly about our response. What kind of response? Alexander asked. That depends partly on what we discover about the extent of the threat, the queen replied. But we may need to consider taking a more proactive approach. Isabella felt her pulse quicken. What do you mean by proactive? I mean that instead of waiting for our opponents to reveal information about us, we might choose to control the narrative by revealing certain things ourselves. On our terms, in our way, with our context. The room fell silent as the implications of this suggestion sank in. The royal family had always operated on the principle of privacy, revealing only what was absolutely necessary for their public duties. The idea of voluntarily sharing personal information was almost revolutionary. You're talking about Catherine's past? Alexander asked. I'm talking about all of our pasts, if necessary, the queen replied. The monarchy survives by maintaining the public's trust and respect. If we appear to be hiding things, if we seem deceptive or secretive beyond what's reasonable for security purposes, we risk losing that trust entirely. Catherine stood up suddenly, moving to join the queen at the window. What would that mean practically? It would mean acknowledging your activism, your arrests, your relationship with the professor, the queen said gently. But it would also mean explaining the context, your growth since then, and how those experiences shaped you into the person who is now serving the crown with such dedication. Isabella could see the appeal of this approach, but she also understood the risks. Mother, once we start down that path, where does it end? If we reveal Catherine's past, what happens when they demand information about other family members? That's precisely why we need to know the full scope of what we're dealing with, the queen replied. Lord Hartwell is expanding his investigation. We need to know what information exists about all of us, and we need to know who has access to it. The weight of this statement settled over them like a heavy blanket. Isabella tried to think through her own past, wondering what might be considered compromising. Her teenage years had been relatively quiet. Her young adult years focused on royal duties and education. But there had been relationships, friendships, moments of poor judgment that seemed insignificant at the time, but could be misconstrued with the right spin. Alexander was clearly having similar thoughts. How far back are we talking about? Childhood? University? Recent years? Everything, the queen said simply. We cannot afford to be surprised. Catherine turned from the window, her face showing a mixture of fear and determination. If we're going to do this, if we're going to expose our lives for examination, then we need to be prepared for what we might find. Not just about ourselves, but about each other. Isabella felt a chill at these words. The royal family, like any family, had its secrets, its complicated relationships, its moments of tension and disagreement. The thought of having all of that exposed and analyzed was terrifying. There's something else we need to consider, Alexander said slowly. The children. If this becomes public, how do we protect them from the fallout? This brought a new dimension to the crisis. Alexander and Catherine had 2 children, Prince William, who was 14, and Princess Charlotte, who was 12. Both were at critical ages where scandal could have lasting psychological effects. The children's welfare must be our top priority, the queen agreed. Whatever we decide to do, we need to ensure they're protected and prepared. Isabella watched her family grapple with these impossible choices and felt a deep sadness for the childhood innocence that would inevitably be lost. Royal children grew up knowing they lived different lives from their peers, but this kind of crisis brought home the reality of that difference in the harshest possible way. I want to speak with Lord Hartwell again, Catherine said suddenly. I want to know exactly what they've found so far, and I want to understand what our options really are. The queen nodded approvingly. That's wise. Knowledge is power, especially in situations like this. As they prepared to end their family meeting, Isabella's phone buzzed with another news alert. This one made her blood run cold. Palace Insider claims royal blackmail scandal just the beginning. She showed the phone to the others, watching their faces reflect her own dismay. Whoever was behind this wasn't content to work in shadows. They wanted public attention, public speculation, and public pressure on the royal family. "It's escalating," Alexander observed grimly. "Yes," the Queen replied, "which means we need to accelerate our own timeline. We can no longer afford the luxury of careful deliberation. Decisions will need to be made quickly." As Isabella left the Queen's apartments with her brother and sister-in-law, she realized that their morning conversation had fundamentally changed everything once again. The whisper that Catherine had shared was growing louder, attracting more attention and demanding more difficult choices from all of them. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. Isabella thought about her scheduled visit to the children's hospital, wondering how she would manage to maintain her composure while reading to sick children when her own world felt like it was falling apart. But that was the essence of royal duty, the ability to compartmentalize, to serve the public regardless of personal crisis, to maintain the dignity of the crown even when everything else felt uncertain. As she walked toward her apartment to change clothes, Isabella steeled herself for what she knew would be one of the most challenging periods of her life. The whisper had become a conversation, and the conversation was about to become very public indeed. Hashtag A Single Whisper, Part 3, a fictional royal drama, *, the emergency family meeting was called for 6 o'clock in the morning, an unprecedented hour that spoke to the gravity of the situation. Isabella had barely slept, her mind racing through possible scenarios and their consequences. As she dressed in the pre-dawn darkness, she could see the first hints of media vans gathering beyond the palace gates, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like mechanical vultures. Lord Hartwell's overnight investigation had yielded results that none of them were prepared for. As Isabella entered the private dining room where the family had gathered, she could see from their faces that the news was worse than anyone had anticipated. The Queen sat at the head of the table, her usual breakfast untouched. Alexander paced by the windows, his phone clutched in his hand, as if expecting another crisis at any moment. Catherine sat motionless in her chair, staring at a manila folder that lay closed before her. "Thank you all for coming so early," Lord Hartwell began, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks of strain. "I'm afraid the situation has developed significantly overnight." He opened his briefcase and withdrew several folders, distributing them around the table. Isabella's heart sank as she saw her own name written on one of them. "What we're dealing with is not a simple blackmail operation," Lord Hartwell continued. "It's a coordinated campaign that has been in planning for at least 2 years. We've identified the source of the leaked information about our investigation, and I'm afraid the truth is disturbing." Catherine finally looked up from her folder. "What did you find?" "Lady Margaret Thornberry has been feeding information to an unknown contact for approximately 18 months, Lord Hartwell said quietly. "Financial records show regular deposits into an account that she established under her maiden name." The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. Lady Margaret had been the Queen's private secretary for over 15 years. She had been privy to the most sensitive family information, present during private conversations, trusted with state secrets. "That's impossible," the Queen said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Margaret has been like family to us." "I'm afraid there's more, Your Majesty," Lord Hartwell continued gently. "She's not the only one. We've identified at least 3 other staff members who have been compromised. But, in their cases, we believe they were coerced rather than paid." Alexander stopped pacing and turned to face the table. "Coerced how?" Lord Hartwell opened another folder. "James Morrison, one of the groundskeepers, has a son with a serious gambling addiction. Someone has been paying the son's debts in exchange for information about the family's daily routines. Sarah Phillips, who works in the kitchen, has been sending money to her elderly mother's care facility. Someone has been supplementing those payments while requesting details about family meals, conversations overheard, and visitor schedules." Isabella felt sick. These were people she saw every day, People who had watched her grow up, people she had trusted completely. The idea that they had been manipulated and coerced was almost worse than outright betrayal. And the third person? The Queen asked, though her tone suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Dr. Patricia Williams, the family physician, Lord Hartwell, said reluctantly. Someone has been threatening to expose an incident from her past involving a prescription drug issue. In exchange for keeping that information private, she's been providing medical information about family members. Catherine's face went white. What kind of medical information? Nothing directly related to your current situation, Princess Catherine, but comprehensive details about family health issues, medical appointments, prescription medications, and even therapy sessions. Isabella's mind reeled. The scope of the surveillance was overwhelming. Every aspect of their private lives had been monitored and cataloged. How is this even possible? How do they get information about Dr. Williams' past? That's what makes this operation so sophisticated, Lord Hartwell explained. They've clearly invested significant resources in researching everyone connected to the family. They identified vulnerabilities and systematically exploited them. The Queen leaned back in her chair, looking older than Isabella had ever seen her. Do we know who is behind this? We're still working on that, but we have some leads. The financial trail suggests connections to a private investigation firm with international clients. We believe this may be part of a larger destabilization campaign targeting multiple European royal families. Alexander sat down heavily in his chair. Multiple families? Preliminary intelligence suggests similar operations in Sweden and Belgium, though those situations haven't escalated to this level yet. Isabella opened her folder with trembling hands, not sure she wanted to see what information had been gathered about her. The file was thicker than she had expected, containing photographs, documents, and what appeared to be transcripts of private conversations. The first photograph showed her at university, laughing with friends at a party. She looked young and carefree, holding a beer and wearing a shirt that read "Question Everything." Nothing scandalous, but certainly informal in a way that contrasted with her current public image. The next section contained information about her romantic relationships, including detailed accounts of a brief engagement to a fellow student that had ended when royal duties became too demanding. There were photographs of them together, intimate moments that had felt private at the time. Most disturbing were the transcripts. Private conversations with friends, family members, even therapy sessions that she had believed were completely confidential. Someone had been listening to her most private thoughts and feelings for years. How long have they been watching us? Isabella asked, her voice shaking. Based on the earliest documents we've found, at least 3 years, Lord Hartwell replied. Possibly longer. Catherine had opened her own folder and was reading through it with a mixture of horror and fascination. They have things here I had forgotten about myself. Conversations from university, emails I sent 20 years ago, even diary entries. How'd they get diary entries? Alexander demanded. We're not entirely sure yet, but we believe they may have gained access to personal storage, possibly through domestic staff or through digital means when personal items were being moved or stored. The Queen had not opened her folder. I assume my file contains similar information? Yes, Your Majesty. Though, given your longer public life, the file is considerably more extensive. Isabella felt a wave of protectiveness toward her mother. The Queen had served with such dignity for so many decades, and the thought of her private life being invaded and cataloged was almost unbearable. What's their endgame? Alexander asked. What do they actually want? Lord Hartwell hesitated. That's where things become even more concerning. The demands aren't just financial anymore. They want policy changes, specific actions regarding international agreements, and influence over royal patronages and charitable positions. The implications hit Isabella like a physical blow. They want to control the monarchy. That appears to be the ultimate goal, yes. They're using personal information as leverage to influence official actions. The Queen finally opened her folder, scanning the contents with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with sensitive information her entire life. This is far beyond anything we can handle quietly, she said after several minutes. We're going to need help from the highest levels of government. I've already reached out to the Prime Minister's office, Lord Hartwell confirmed. They're treating this as a matter of national security. Catherine closed her folder and looked around the table. So what happens now? Do we give in to their demands? Do we go public with everything? Do we try to fight them? We do what royal families have always done in times of crisis, the Queen said, her voice regaining some of its customary strength. We adapt, we endure, and we protect the institution that we serve. Alexander reached over and took Catherine's hand. But we also protect each other. Whatever we decide together. Isabella felt a surge of pride in her family despite the circumstances. Even faced with this level of threat and violation, they were choosing unity over self-preservation. There is one more thing, Lord Hartwell said reluctantly. They've given us an ultimatum. We have 48 hours to begin complying with their demands, or they start releasing information publicly. What specific demands? The Queen asked. Lord Hartwell produced another document. They want you to withdraw support for the International Climate Accord that's being negotiated next month. They want Catherine to resign from her position with the Children's Welfare Foundation. And they want Princess Isabella to publicly endorse a specific candidate in the upcoming European Parliament elections. Isabella's blood ran cold. Using the royal family's influence to affect political outcomes was exactly the kind of thing that could destroy the monarchy's carefully maintained political neutrality. It would violate centuries of constitutional tradition. Those demands are impossible, she said. We can't comply with any of them without fundamentally changing the role of the monarchy, which may be exactly what they want, Alexander observed grimly. If we comply, we lose credibility and constitutional legitimacy. If we don't comply, they destroy us with scandal. Either way, the monarchy is damaged or eliminated. The Queen stood slowly, moving to the window where she could see the growing crowd of media gathering outside the gates. Then, we need a third option. What kind of third option? Catherine asked. The Queen turned back to face the table, and Isabella could see that the strategic mind that had guided the nation through decades of challenges was fully engaged. We take control of the narrative completely. We reveal everything ourselves, in our own way, with our own context, and we dare them to do their worst. The audacity of this suggestion took Isabella's breath away. The idea of voluntarily revealing decades of private information, personal struggles, and family secrets was almost incomprehensible. Mother, the risk. Alexander began. The risk of doing nothing is greater, the Queen interrupted. If we allow ourselves to be controlled by these threats, we cease to be a constitutional monarchy and become puppets of whoever has the most damaging information about us. Catherine was nodding slowly. She's right. If we're going to be exposed anyway, at least this way we control the timing and the context. Isabella felt a mixture of terror and exhilaration. It was a massive gamble, but it was also the only move that preserved their agency and dignity. How would we do it? A comprehensive televised address, the Queen said decisively. Complete transparency about what we've been facing, acknowledgement of our past mistakes and human failings, and a challenge to the public to decide whether they want a real royal family or perfect fictional characters. Lord Hartwell looked concerned. Your Majesty, the constitutional implications of such an approach will be less serious than the constitutional implications of allowing foreign agents to manipulate the crown, the Queen finished firmly. Isabella looked around the table at her family. Catherine's face showed fear, but also determination. Alexander looked like he was calculating risks and possibilities. The Queen appeared more energized than Isabella had seen her in years. If we do this, Isabella said slowly, there's no going back. Once we reveal everything, we can't unreveal it. That's true, the Queen acknowledged. But we'll have done it on our terms, as a free choice rather than under coercion. That may make all the difference in how the public receives it. As the meeting concluded, Isabella realized that the single whisper that had started this crisis was about to become a roar that would echo around the world. They had moved far beyond Catherine's university activism. They were now talking about fundamentally redefining what it meant to be a royal family in the modern world. The sun was fully up now, and Isabella could hear the sounds of the palace coming to life around them. In just a few hours, they would need to make a decision that would affect not only their own lives, but the future of the monarchy itself. As she walked back to her apartments, Isabella reflected on how much had changed since that quiet morning just a week ago when she had walked these same corridors in peaceful contemplation. The whisper had become a shout, and now they all had to decide how loudly they were willing to shout back.